The medieval period refers to a time frame roughly about 500 of the Common Era to 1500 of the Common Era, and that's when we start to see the emergence of the Renaissance. Looking at this image, it gives us insight into what's taking place. And, I'll point out that we might think that this is Apollo because we see those connections with those arrows, that tree that I had pointed out, and the arrows. This is not Apollo. This is, in fact, Saint Sebastian. All right, Saint Sebastian. This is a period of syncretism, or blending of different ideas, and while we tend to think of it as the Dark Ages, you know what, it's not that dark, sir. People aren't literate in the way that they had been in the past, and pagan science is being by and large omitted. But we are seeing a number of beliefs come together in very interesting ways, forming this belief system that's dominant for at least the next 1,000 years before science starts to re-emerge. The dominant approach to healing at this point of time is back to that personalistic model. And they're drawing upon dominant beliefs within Christianity, for example, the role that God and demons may play in health and healing. They've moved away mostly from the naturalistic explanations that the Greeks had offered and the pagan Romans had offered as well. Here we have the Exorcist, and if you've seen the film, according to Gabriel Amorth, he says that while it's being exaggerated, the Exorcist that was produced in 1973, the film, it's a fairly exacting depiction of what goes on during an exorcism. In fact, exorcisms still continue to this very day. Gabriel Amorth says he's performed well over 70,000 exorcisms at the Vatican, and this is also associated with other forms of Christianity as well. And in fact, when we look at the idea of exorcism, some of it is really pretty mundane. There's two basic types of exorcism. We have a simple exorcism and what's referred to as a solemn exorcism. A simple exorcism is baptism, and any ordained priest can perform a baptism. In contrast, a solemn exorcism is ultimately the attempt to remove an evil demon that has possessed an individual. Now, when we think about this, we should do so in a scientific model. And it's fairly easy to reject the idea of demons and spirits and say, yeah, that's nonsense. But if we try to get into the cultural system and understand that particular illness and the way it's being expressed, perhaps we're looking at issues with psychological health. And that's raised a number of questions for modern physicians, psychiatrists, and psychologists. And they say that when individuals are encouraged to engage in this solemn exorcism and be exorcised, there really should be a psychological assessment first, because you may in fact encourage delusions that an individual has about demonic possession. Okay, with that said, I want to say that, even though we live in a scientific society, a lot of these ideas are still around us. We draw upon them and they help people understand what's going on. Let's move along and take a look at some of the ways that people addressed health in the medieval period. Medieval medicine can be seen as consisting of a couple of different stages: monastic medicine and eventually scholastic medicine, and all the way along there's something that's called folk medicine that continues to exist. Monastic medicine is medicine that's practiced by monks, and keep in mind, all of the medicine that existed in the past, that scientific medicine, is pagan. So they're not going to, for the most part, they're not going to engage in that. And medicine is going to be taken care of monks who live in monasteries. In addition to that, we also have folk medicine that's being practiced by common people. And they're drawing upon, for example, herbal remedies and maybe even reverting back to pagan beliefs as well. Around 1130 of the Common Era, we get the emergence of scholastic medicine, and what this signifies is a shift in power from monks practicing medicine to lay people who are educated in the newly developed university. The reality, though, of monastic medicine is it's wildly diverse. And it's hard to really characterize it as something that just adheres to religious doctrine, because it doesn't. It relies upon some of the old theories, while it shouldn't. For example, Hippocratic ideas. So we do find contradictions, and people are using whatever beliefs they can to address health. And in the end, historians, they've emphasized the role of the Christian worldview. But as I've pointed out, there's a variety of approaches that we're going to see here when we look at medieval medicine and the way it's practiced in Christian countries. So a few of the examples, we've already looked at exorcism. Okay, so that's something that people would regularly do to engage in religious healing. In addition to that, you'd have healing at religious shrines. So in the same way that the Egyptians went into those incubation chambers with those priests for psychological healing, perhaps. And it also happened during the Greek era at the temples of Asclepius. We also have healing shrines here that continue to persist, and oftentimes they're built right on top of those old pagan temples. This is a type of faith healing. In addition to that, perhaps one of the most important elements of medieval medicine is last rites to heal the soul. And this has a lot of similarity to the ideas that were offered by Plato. We shouldn't worry about the body, this corporeal thing, this physical thing. The real riches, the real wealth is all going to come in heaven, and we need to make sure that the very least the soul is taken care of and ensured that it is clean, so to speak, of any immoral behavior that you might have engaged in, that you've repented for those ideas, those sins that a person has engaged in. Another element of religious healing during the medieval period would be the reliance upon relics. Okay, so if you've ever been to Europe and into some of those churches, or even in the Americas or South America, quite often you find relics. Relics are body parts, or something that's been connected to a martyr or a saint. So at some of these churches, my daughter was fascinated when we went into churches, for example, in Italy or France. You saw really mummified bodies of saints there, or martyrs, or various parts of them. In Italy, for example, there is a Galileo's finger, ironically his middle finger. Either way, a first-class relic refers to physical remains, body parts, complete or in part, and they're associated with the ability to help an individual heal. They're a vessel, perhaps, to contact God and ask for healing. Moving down to a second-class relic, this is an item that's been in contact with a saint or martyr, for example, the plate that they ate off of, or their clothing. Okay, so those are some of the examples, and they're believed to have power vested in them. Third-class relics, something that's been in contact with either a first or a second-class relic, even to the extent that, and I believe it was St. Paul, when he walked down the streets, anything that his shadow touched was believed to take on some of his power. And if he walked past an individual on the street, and he had some of his possessions out there, well, those possessions, because St. Paul's shadow touched them, would be defined as a third-class relic. So this plays a very significant role in healing and rituals, and forces a lot of individuals to engage in pilgrimages, to go to these places where these special remains are associated or kept. Remember we were talking about the Egyptians and how they mythologize, or they're engaging that mythologizing of body parts, associating particular organs, for example. We'll use a short form with gods. Well, the same thing's happening here. Particular organs or illnesses, they're not being associated with gods, but rather they're being associated with saints. So a lot of these ideologies, past ideologies, they persist through time. They're just given a new spin. With respect to folk medicine, then, I'll go over here, and also, we're going to see some connection to monastic medicine here as well. Some of the examples that we see, cannibalism. Yeah, believe it or not, even in monasteries, individuals made marmalade from blood of humans, and that was seen as a remedy. They made cured human flesh that could be consumed. Even Francis Bacon, the father of the scientific method in the 1600s, he said, you know what? In any medicine, mummy bits can't do any harm. They can only make it better. So cannibalism, that figures fairly prominently in the history of medieval medicine, even to the extent, and as pointed out in our textbook, individuals, when somebody was being, they were being executed, people would come down to that place in the city center, and they'd take up their cups, and they'd hold their cups underneath of those individuals who had been killed so they can get some of the blood to drink immediately. Now, that couldn't have been good for health either, but it did figure into their healing methods. We're going to see that there's also some mythical cures, and even though we're in Christian times, pixies, for example, figure into their worldview and are seen as somebody that can cause illness. Ancient medicine, Hippocratic medicine, figures into their system from time to time. And there's a series of folk remedies that might include herbs, for example, and various potions or poultices, stuff that you'd rub on your illness, your wound, for example, or a tumor if you had one. Like I said, there's a lot of different approaches that people are using. It's quite varied. And then, of course, there's the absolutely fantastical and unfortunate at the same time. Here we have a depiction. It's referred to as Virgil's dream. Sometimes it's called the miracle. Sometimes it's called the miracle of the black leg. And two saints are depicted here. I'll highlight them. Saint Cosmos and Saint Damien. And they're credited with the first transplant. And like I said, fantastical that anybody could engage in a leg transplant at this point of time in history. That's why it's called the miracle. Somehow they did that, the miracle of the black leg, the unfortunate. Here, unfortunately, we see a perpetuation of ideas of inequality, that somehow this white individual who had to have his leg amputated, he's going to benefit from the leg of somebody else. And like I said, very unfortunate history as well. Let's move to the next slide. Saint Bede, he's the individual that came up with that system of referring to time, Anno Domini, and BC, before Christ. Okay, so that's one of his contributions. And the book that he's looking at here, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm going to tell you he's probably reading Hippocrates, because he did think that Hippocrates, even though he was a Greek pagan, he thought that, maybe he was actually a Christian, and he just didn't know it, even though Jesus hadn't emerged. That was one of his ideas, and he tried to create more of a religious document as it pertained to Hippocratic writings. Anyhow, what does his medicine look like? So, like I said, this is Saint Bede, and he's practicing monastic medicine, a good example of monastic medicine that's taking place in and about the 700 of the Common Era. What did his medicine look like? Well, some of the things that he talked about was using, and again, we have this picture on here, books, he thought. I'm going to take a little piece of this book, and I'm going to bring it over here, because pieces of book from Ireland, as far as he was concerned, had magical powers, especially if an individual had been bitten by a snake, because, of course, there are no snakes in Ireland, he pointed out. Other types of cures. He said that a lot of illnesses can be traced to pixies. Pixies who live in the forest. Now these pixies, and very interestingly, they've got little bows and arrows. And you know what? With those arrows, they send, yeah, you're thinking exactly what I'm writing, aren't you? It's with those arrows that they send disease. This is remarkably similar to some of that symbolism that existed with Apollo. Like I said, some of these ideas, they don't disappear. They're just kind of reframed and discussed in a different way. So as Porter, historian of medicine, explains, these are the dark ages. People aren't engaging in that pagan science any longer. And by and large, they're illiterate, and they're drawing a whole lot of their information from supernaturalism. Okay, let's take a look at another healer, Saint Hildegard. Here, I'm going to place an annotation up top. Saint Hildegard. Saint Hildegard, I think at any other point of time in history, she probably would have been defined as a witch. And the reason why, she had these visions. And I'm also going to tell you about some of her practices as well. But anyway, she had these visions from a very early age. And her parents, they got really worried about what she was seeing. So they took her, let's go over to this image on the right-hand side. They took her to a monk at a monastery, and they said, she has these images, she's painting them, they're really scary, they're horrific, it looks like the apocalypse, and the devil, is she possessed? And the monk talked to her, looked at her images, and said, no, she's not possessed. And I'll also add that her parents were very well-to-do individuals, influential in the community. And the monk said, no, she isn't possessed. She's actually communicating directly with God. She's prophetic. And she actually became the personal consult to the Pope at the time because she could speak directly to God. Like I said, at any other time this might have, and especially as we get into the 1600s, this probably would have been defined as witchcraft. Anyhow, what did her medicine look like? Eventually, she goes to a convent, and things don't work out well for her, so she creates her own convent, her own nunnery, and there she begins to develop a medicine that looks very much like the occult stuff that you see today, perhaps if you've ever been into an occult shop. Herbal remedies, that figures into her philosophy of medicine. Also gemstone, gemology. She developed the field. She's the pioneer of it. And like I said, all of her books, you can find that stuff in any occult shop. I think there was one on Barton Street in Hamilton at one point of time. And it talks about, for example, topaz and how that could be used to create understanding, and sapphires and all of these precious stones, which makes me think, how often did the common individual come across precious stones? One that they can stick in their mouth and hold it there for a while, a few days, to develop understanding. She also talked about various creature cures as well. I'm going to give you an example of one of these. So, for example, say your partner has issues with their sight. Okay. She suggests a particular approach. What you want to do is you want to take a fish bladder and you want to marinate it in fine wine from Rhine. And then after it marinates in that fine wine from Rhine, that's difficult to say. Do it 10 times. After it's marinated, you take it and you apply it to the eyes of your loved one. And by midnight, he'll be able to see just fine again. All right. Something a little fishy about that one. In addition to the fishy, there's just the outright batty. For example, if somebody suffered from jaundice, her idea is what you do is you go out and you get a bat, right? I'll draw a little bat here. And you take that bat and you tie it to the individual's back and you leave it there until it dies. And once it's dead, then you shift that bat to the front of the individual so it's on their chest, and you continue to let it rot there for a few days. And then eventually the jaundice, the yellowing of the skin, it will disappear on the individual that suffered from jaundice. Like I said, outright batty. There's no question about it. So we get fish bladder, we get bats, we get all kinds of stuff that sounds a heck of a lot like that brew, you might find in that witch's cauldron. Brewing out. Like I said, at any other time, she probably would have been defined as a witch. By the time we get to Hildegard, things are getting pretty sketchy in the West. I'm going to pick up with a discussion at the West. However, we're going to go now to the East around that time frame, 500 CE, and kind of catch up with what's going on in the West and see how the East is doing with their ideas with respect to medicine. All right, so to understand what's taking place in the East, I'm just going to backtrack here to a few ideas. Okay, I had talked about the Council of Nicaea. If you don't remember, this is a council that was headed by a pagan and is the first Christian ecumenical council. The pagan at that point of time was Constantine. And it was at that meeting that he said, okay, Christians, fathers of the church, bishops, you need to get your ideas straight. When was Jesus born? When did Jesus die? Was he a God and the Son of God at the same time? Or was he the Son of God and he was made a God after his death? As pointed out, not everybody agreed with the ideas of the dominant Christian beliefs today. And they voted. They said, okay, when was Jesus born? When was Easter and all this stuff? Was he, and perhaps this was the most important question, was he God and the Son of God at the same time? And some people said yes, the majority. And some people, for example, like the Nestorians or the Arians, not the Arians you might be thinking of associated with Nazi Germany, following Arius, they said, no, he wasn't God and the Son of God. That's not logically possible. They lost. And those individuals were exiled. So they had to leave the West and they went into the East. And that's where we start to get the formation of the Eastern belief system. The Nestorians, they took their books with them. They took the books, the works of Hippocrates and Aristotle, all of the Greek pagan science, because I think mostly they were more of a philosopher, even though they had that connection to religion. They believed in Jesus of Nazareth. They just saw him differently. They also prized a lot of the science and philosophy that had emerged. So they move into the East, to an area in modern-day Iraq now, okay, and it's referred to as Jundi Shapur, and there they begin to engage in a translation movement. So they're translating information, they're taking Greek, and they're translating it into Arabic. And it's here, at Jundi Shapur, in 55 of the Common Era, that the first Eastern hospitals develop, okay, and is referred to as a Bimaristan. So Jundi Shapur, it's believed to be the very first Bimaristan. Bimar means ill person, stan means place. Bimaristan. Now the Bimaristans, they had that function of the Christian hospital. There's no question about it, okay? So they were there to deal with a sick public. But I think when we look at their hospitals, they were even more similar to today's hospitals than the Christian hospital was. So they got that one component, that sick public that they're both dealing with, but they also believed in the value of knowledge. These actually were research institutions. They housed libraries. For example, one of the Bimaristans in Tripoli, it houses 3 million volumes of information at around 900 of the Common Era. And to compare that, the University of Paris in the 15th century only had 40,000 volumes of information. These were massive research institutions. And, sometimes people downplay the knowledge that Arabic cultures have had, or the role that Arabic cultures have played in science. If it was not for the Arabic cultures at this point of time, and eventually Islam, Greek knowledge, Roman knowledge would have been lost. All that philosophy, all that medicine, all that science would have disappeared. At this time, they believed in the value of that knowledge, and they wanted to preserve it. A few examples of Eastern Islamic healers. Al-Razi. And here in our textbook, you'll see that I'm using their proper names. Al-Razi is this individual's Arabic name. It was eventually translated to Razis. I would be able to make that association on a test. Razis is Al-Razi ibn Sina. Razis is Al-Razi. I won't test you on the date. But anyhow, eventually when people started looking at Al-Razi's material, and it was considered very valuable, precious information once it started to make its way back into the West, they said, yeah, Al-Razi just doesn't sound Latin. Let's change it to Razis, a more Latin sounding name. Anyhow, he was the first individual to distinguish between smallpox and measles. He invented the plaster cast and an iron catheter. In addition to that, he also recognized that some diseases just couldn't be treated. For example, leprosy. Okay, and we know that leprosy, it is common in this area at this point of time now. It's not set off. Finally, he claims that 1,000 books were better than 1,000 years of observation. Now, like I said, this guy is really important eventually when it comes to the West. And this is all about authority. And that has an influence upon Western medicine. Don't challenge the books. Don't trust the eyes in the same way as those books. So we get that reliance upon authority. And this really, and I don't want to say that the East didn't make a contribution to medicine. They certainly did. We have, for example, the iron catheter, the plaster cast. But if they weren't chained to this idea that books were better than observation and perhaps experiment, we might have seen even more development than there was. And there was a lot. Like I said, don't get me wrong, there was a lot in the East, while the West is thinking about pixies and they're using bats and gems and all that stuff. The East, man, the science that's going on there is just amazing. In fact, in the East, people say, and there's a phrasing that Allah sends no disease without cure. They believe that it's their obligation to look into nature and find some of these cures. And in fact, science and pursuing knowledge is seen as a holy act. Now that's going to change eventually. But for the early years, these individuals very much believe that it's their religious obligation to inquire into and preserve knowledge. All right, so here we have Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, his Latinized version of the name. This guy's responsible for pioneering uroscopy. And the way that this worked is, you'd take this, some urine, and you'd hold it up to the light, and you'd look at it to see if it was cloudy or not, what the color was, and then you'd, sweet, what's up with that? No, don't worry. This is iced tea in a little beaker. Anyhow, he pioneers uroscopy. He discovers that some of this stuff, some of this urine is sweet, and recognizing that that is a health issue, of course, he had identified diabetes. In addition to this, he writes a book that's referred to as Al-Quran, or the Canon, and it becomes the definitive book in medicine when medical writings and literature from the East are rediscovered, or discovered anyhow for the very first time in around the 1200s. Al-Quran, or the Canon, becomes the definitive book of medicine as it's discovered in about 1200 CE. And this is ultimately the result of a migration movement and an exile from the East, and an individual by the name of Constantine of Africa. He's carrying a number of philosophical treatises and medical works with him. And as the West rediscovers this becomes the authority in medical knowledge. And you're probably looking and saying, what is that stuff? I'm hard-pressed to explain it. Yeah, I can see some veins and arteries here. So this is the nervous system in part. I guess the muscles, I'm not sure. I can't identify these muscles. And here I want to stress that this is what people are learning from. And over here, I don't know, we have Batman or something. I'm not sure. It doesn't have the right amount of ribs. I'm not sure what that clavicle is. I don't know, maybe wearing Hanes underwear here or something. In fact, Giorgio might have something to say about this. Yeah, no, Giorgio, not aliens, but maybe set the stage for the idea of what an alien looks like. All joking aside, what we're going to see take place eventually, and like I said, for the next 1,500 years, well, not 1,500, next couple of hundred of years until we get to the 1500s, these are the very best medical, anatomical, and physiological drawings that exist. And then all of a sudden, it's going to change. Sometimes Ibn al-Nafis is credited with the first model of circulation, and we can see that he's using an equally excellent drawing there as well. So he challenges some of the early ideas of Galen, for example, as pointed in our text in Avicenna, and he does provide the first description of circulation. What I want to point out is this is only argumentatively. He does not engage in experiment. He cannot illustrate that blood actually circulates through the body. That only comes with William Harvey in the late 1600s. So he says thin blood moves into the right chamber of the heart, and then it exits the left chamber of the heart, moves through the body, and he discusses the lungs there. But this is not coming from experimentation. So this is theory. The first proof comes from William Harvey. We have a very interesting circle of knowledge taking place. So with that Council of Nicaea, pagan science, it begins to exit the West, Byzantium over here, and it begins to move into the East until we get to this translation movement that's taking place at Jundi Shapur, and we get the very first Bimaristan. And as pointed out, these are research institutions. There's a lot of knowledge being held here. In fact, the East preserved all of the knowledge that the ancient pagans had developed. The Quran, it's encouraging learning. It's encouraging science. In fact, it says that learning is, it's interpreted that learning is an act of worship in Islam. Now that persists for a period of time, but eventually fundamentalism says, yeah, you know what? In all honesty, this stuff we're looking at, it's pagan. And we probably shouldn't be doing that. And that forces a movement out of the East and into the West. Now here, So we've got the work of ancient Islamic scientists. It's moving into Europe through Constantine of Africa. And it finds itself in Monte Cassino, Italy, where there's this massive translation movement and the development of the very first universities. The Council of Claremont, as discussed in our textbook. Now I'm tying this all together. Remember what's happened if we go back to Bede, who said there's pixies in the forest that make us sick with arrows. And Hildegard, who's saying, here, take this bat, tie it to your back, and then move it to your stomach and let it rot there. And in the meantime, take some gems and put them in your mouth and hold them in your hands. Council of Claremont says, this is way too disruptive. This is not the life of a monk. This is wild. So the Council of Claremont, they forbid monks to practice medicine. And now medicine moves into the newly founded universities. For example, Salerno, which is the very first medical school on the face of this earth. And then into Bologna, the University of Bologna. Again, very, very early universities. And here, medicine is no longer in the hands of religious individuals, where their job is religion, priests and monks, but rather lay people who are being educated in these old Greek sciences.